Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Political State from the Oklahoman. I'm Ben Felder here in the Oklahoman's downtown video studio. Joining me this week is our state capitol reporter, Dale Denwalt, and our new news director, Chris Castile. Chris, congrats on the gig, and thanks for taking time out of what's becoming more and more a busier day for you to talk politics. But up until recently, and still will be doing some political coverage, I mean, you've been on the trail of this governor's race, and earlier this week, a man of many hats, you moderated the first debate between Drew Edmondson and Kevin Stitt, the Democrat and Republican nominee for governor. You know, in watching this debate, I think Edmondson performed as well as you'd think for a seasoned politician, and Kevin Stitt performed probably about as well as you'd expect for kind of an outsider newcomer who's really still kind of new to running for office. He's never done it before. I'm curious, what was for both of you, Dale and Chris, what were your big takeaways from this first debate between these two candidates?
Well, I think just from a content standpoint with the two, I thought it was a really good debate to show how divided they are on some of the biggest issues, whether it's taxes, Medicaid, expansion. You know, I think that there was clear differences between them on those two things, and I think that each of them articulated their positions well. I think Dale did a good story on how close they kind of were on some criminal justice stuff. But there will be a clear choice, and not only in experience and position, but I just think in the way that they approach government too, and that's probably a function of their experience.
Yeah.
We also saw a little bit of their personality shine through. Drew Edmondson, kind of the folksy charm candidate. He got the crowd to laugh several times, although I think
it was
there were a lot of people in that crowd
there were a lot of Drew people
for him. Kevin Stitt was real forceful, kind of matter of fact, and speaking directly, probably as best as he could to the question. Kind of what you would expect from a CEO, right?
Yeah.
And so that kind of personality showed for both of them. And I think it kind of goes to how they present themselves as candidates. Drew Edmondson obviously is a politician. He doesn't back down from that. He doesn't shy away from that moniker, even though he says that he's proud of the record that he's run as a public servant. Kevin Stitt is what you would expect out of someone who is coming out of sort of the left field, out of the private sector, in politics for the first time,
right field,
trying to make
right, yeah. Well, and also for Stitt, I mean, it's kind of a role reversal a little bit, because if you look, we often have talked about the big three Republican candidates these last several months. You had Todd Lamb, Mick Cornett, and then Kevin Stitt that was fighting to survive and did, and then ultimately won. He was the outsider, and he was running against, Todd Lamb, who was kind of the consensus front runner, for many years. Mick Cornett, won the primary. But in this red state of Oklahoma, there's no way around it. Kevin Stitt is the front runner, and some early polls are bearing that out. So now he is kind of that, running with that mantle. How does that change things, do you think, for Stitt, that now, he's kind of, it's his race to lose in a way? Well, that wasn't the case during the primary.
No, it wasn't. And I think that, one thing that he really enjoyed through the entire year was momentum. Stitt did, and I'm sure he had a little bit coming out of the runoff, having beaten, Mick Cornett, and then 2 months earlier Todd Lamb. He had nothing. He had a ton of momentum, and I think that's probably going to slow right now a little bit. I'm not sure. At this point, I'm not sure how much he can widen the gap. I totally agree that he's a front runner. You've seen a couple polls where it's 3, maybe it's 5, 6, or something like that. But I'm not sure, what he can do to really widen that from this point on. Especially when it looks like we should talk. I should mention this: that the Democratic Governors Association started airing ads Thursday, and Drew Edmondson campaign is running ads starting, I think, this morning. This is Friday, September 28th. That link Stitt to Fallon, Governor Mary Fallon, the deeply unpopular Governor Mary Fallon, and basically saying more of the same. I think the DGA ad, the Democratic Governor's ad, is actually, it's borderline inaccurate, really, and about both of them. But it makes the point that, this is just more of the same. You know, Stitt would be more of the same on education. Our schools went to heck under Governor Mary Fallin, and Stitt would just, you know, continue those same policies.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, that's a little bit of a stretch. I mean, Stitt has been running as this outsider, you know, especially against Fallin. I mean, he hasn't really spoken her name too much, but the times that he has, he's been critical of her leadership, as you would expect. I mean, she's pulled, you know, her approval rating has been fairly low the last few years. You know, it's kind of normal for, you know, a lame duck governor, you know, when you've got an open seat.
There's a lot of Fallin
connecting Stitt to Fallin, besides the R that's next to their name, and granted, I think they would support some proposals, but I mean, Dale, what do you think is the biggest difference between Stitt and Fallin?
Probably, you know, the experience. Mary Fallin, before she was governor, was in politics for quite a while, both in the state legislature and the U.S. Congress.
And lieutenant governor.
That's right. She comes from, although it's kind of in the metro, she comes from a rural part of the state, a little bit more rural, so to speak, east of here. And you know, she's sort of the generation of Republicans who came up in the 80s and the 90s, whereas with Kevin Stitt, I think his voting record probably shows you that maybe he didn't think a lot about electoral politics, at least, until recently.
Yeah.
So I think those are the biggest difference. You can't view him as you can't expect him to be the kind of Republican that Oklahomans have known for the last 10 years.
That's a perfect point. He's not part of this establishment. And given his spotty voting record, he could probably say he'd never even voted for Mary Fallin.
Yeah, well, and you talk about, you know, the time that Fallin came up, I mean, the political climate was different. I mean, this was kind of a Republican wave.
It was.
But she really benefited from this really anti-DC, you know, rhetoric. Now, there still is anti-DC rhetoric, but Republicans are in charge now. You don't have Obama now as kind of the boogeyman that it was for Republicans when she was first elected in 2010, and you saw that kind of wave. How is Stitt, I mean, what is Stitt's stance on the federal government? I mean, there were some specific issues that you asked him about.
Yeah, so he says, and I don't think he's that well versed, I mean, he's not that fluent even yet in state issues. I think he's still really trying to learn these federal state dynamics as well. But, you know, that's one of the things I asked him the other night, because I've heard him say so many times, I'd love to get every federal dollar we can get. I've been meeting with the delegation about that, you know, what can we do? Well, you know, if that's the case, Medicaid expansion would be totally in your wheelhouse, you know, because it's like a 9-to-1 federal to state, you know, dollar match.
Yeah.
So you know, again, I think that he's really just still kind of grappling with all of these programs and all of these different levels of government, things that he hasn't really thought about it beyond, you know, the ones that regulate mortgages, you know, which is what he's been in, or regulated whatever other, you know, kind of side business he's been in. I don't think he's ever really looked at government holistically. You know, it's always just been this agency or that I have to answer to each year.
Is the climate amongst Oklahoma voters different when it comes to Medicaid expansion than it was in 2010 or after that? I mean, voters saw this as Obamacare. And
that's a great question. You know, I think that's a great question.
Yeah, I think so. Whenever people talk about it, they don't talk about Obamacare anymore. They talk about Medicaid expansion, and you know, the boogeyman's out of office, so to speak. President Obama is long gone. Republicans are in power, and they could do something to the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare if they wanted to, and if they could get enough votes, right? And when you talk about Medicaid expansion, that was always a part of the ACA. And probably the biggest reason why Oklahoma never accepted it. But at this point, I think it's more about the merits of the proposal. You're going to get a lot more discussion about the merits of the proposal rather than a cloud hanging over it because it was introduced by Barack Obama.
Especially these situations that have come about with these rural hospitals too. You know, like the Pauls Valley one. You've got one in the Panhandle that can't pay its bills, and Edmondson's just hammering that point home about Medicaid expansion helping rural hospitals, because a lot of their uncompensated care is probably, I mean, I haven't seen the metrics of all this, but I would think a lot of it in a rural area are people without health insurance. You know?
Yeah.
Whereas Medicaid would be reimbursing these hospitals if indeed these lower income people had it.
Yeah. Well, you asked specifically about that at the debate, and I imagine this will continue to be a topic of disagreement between the two candidates they're going to have to answer to.
It should be a legislative issue. I just really think that legislative candidates should have to be answering to this.
And this is kind of a tough one. I mean, it's always kind of, I mean, a House member, a Senate member, they're always just one vote. But it always makes it easy to dodge the issue, too, for lawmakers, because then you can say, like, well, we're going to have to see what the legislature looks like, and what everyone wants to do. And I'm not necessarily for this, but you haven't had to peg them down on the vote. It just kind of gives you an example of what it's like running for governor, statewide office. You're expected to answer for everything, even though the issue would have to, you're right, would have to start with the legislature.
Yeah. And that's something that Chris asked Drew Edmondson is, Drew said that he thinks that there's probably could be a way that he could go ahead and do that without the legislature intervening, but Oklahoma has a law.
Yeah, I don't think that's.
Yeah, Oklahoma's law that says that we can't do that.
The best path for Edmondson, I think, is if he wins, he can argue that he has a mandate. I mean, a Democrat winning in Oklahoma, will he say, listen, there are some core issues I ran on. This is one of them. Now, I don't know that the legislature budges on that, because now a lot of them just won election. They're not going to think about re-election for at least a couple of years, at least in the House. But speaking of what Edmondson would find if he became a legislator, he's also continues to push the issue of the gross production tax, raising it to 7%. I mean, Chris, another thing you asked him about is how do you do that? Because the legislature is still going to be pretty overwhelmingly Republican. The biggest blue wave is probably still not going to change that.
No. So they're not going to come in and go, all right, take the oath of office and go, now let's raise us some taxes, man.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the last thing they're going to want to think about. Not only because they just, had a tax package, but there's new revenue rolling in, and the economy has improved significantly. You've been writing this every month. The coffers are filling up, so talk about a tough sell. It's a tough sell. It was a tough sell last fall when everything was coming unglued. It was hard. You couldn't get 3/4.
It took months and special sessions to actually get anything accomplished. Daily press conferences from at least the Democrats, sometimes Republicans, talking about how the legislature was jammed up, and that was in a crisis situation. So imagine Drew Edmondson proposing a tax package, a tax increase package, to a legislature who is seeing the economy growing and more money coming into state government, and the rainy day half full again. So it's going to be a really hard sell, and it's going to take a lot of work politically, I think, for a Governor Edmondson to actually get anything accomplished as far as raising taxes.
Well, and if he wins, you'll probably will see House and Senate leaders come out even before the session starts, before he's sworn in, saying, here's kind of our general budget plan. We've got more money coming in. See, we're going to put more money to education. We're going to put more money to healthcare. We don't need to raise taxes, which makes me wonder, could we see some of those plans even before the election? I bet Stitt would love to see that, love to see the legislature already saying, hey, we know we're going to have enough money to increase the budget.
Well, this is a completely different wrinkle, because you have Kevin Stitt, the leader of the Republican Party, if he wins governor, leader of the state, and you have Republican leaders who have kind of enjoyed their autonomy on the legislative level. As the Speaker of the House and the pro tem of the Senate, how willing are you to cow to the incoming governor's policy plans? Do you sit down with your caucus and say, here's what we want to do as a legislature, but then here comes Kevin Stitt saying, this is what I want you to do? How much agreement do we get from a Republican governor and the next legislature on the first day?
Well, I think we've been talking. We may have talked about this on your show last week. He's already meeting with them. He's meeting with John Echols and the Speaker of the House, McCall, and Greg, the incoming Senate President. He's that's one of the things that he tries to pitch about himself, is that he is this kind of CEO that always wants input from everybody. That he's got a policy at his company. You can say anything in this boardroom, or in this meeting room, conference room. I want to hear what you've got to say. I think he wants to hit the ground running. I think he's, kind of impatient, when it comes to that kind of stuff. It's sort of like, let's set a goal, let's get in a direction, then let's move that way. We don't need to sit around, rehashing stuff that we all know about. Let's decide what we're going to do about it and get a plan and go. Yeah.
Well, coming from a mortgage industry, which in America you can get a mortgage on your phone in a matter of hours, it's going to be a rude awakening on the pace of things at the Capitol.
And I think that's actually a really good point, because I think that's, given the revenue situation, it's not a crisis anymore. They can all just kind of relax about that. go through a halfway normal budget process. He wants to work on management of government.
Yeah, but you can't. I think if you're going to say it's not a crisis anymore, you have to say it's not a crisis when you look at the money we're going to have coming in. Because when you say it's not a crisis anymore, if you're in Pauls Valley and the hospital is closed, no, I'm saying if that's what they're saying, they have to be careful about that because there's teachers who are saying, listen, we still have major challenges in our classroom. There's communities where their hospitals are closing. So you got to be careful. If you're going to say it's not a crisis anymore, you got to say, well, it's not a crisis anymore in the sense that we have more money coming our way. I think voters are going to want to know what's your plan to do with it.
We talked about that some the other night, and I think that's absolutely right. You still have schools. We had the story either I think this morning or yesterday morning, basically holding bake sales, to buy the basic supplies of schools.
Yeah.
You've got hospitals trying to stay alive on GoFundMe. So yeah, you're right. There's the crisis isn't over.
And that's a sensitive community. And from I was watching the debate online from another state, but so I had a chance to kind of track social media and comments on the YouTube page. And there was a moment where you asked him about some rural schools, especially not having teachers to fill like AP courses and stuff like that. And he made a remark that say, well, maybe we can use video technology. And I think to be fair to him, the context is he was saying we could fill the gap until we have a better plan of getting more professionally trained teachers in that hole. But some took it as you just want our kids to learn from a video teacher. I mean, and I think they've come to their frustration honestly. My point being is that it's not just educators. There's a lot of buckets, but especially for educators and those connected to schools, there's still a lot of raw emotion, and they've come to that honestly. They're justified in a lot of that emotion, and so.
And Edmondson talks about that a lot. I mean, that's a centerpiece of his.
And one of the biggest lines from the debate was, if you think this is all about pay, then you're not paying attention. I want to ask you, Chris, in Sunday's issue of the Oklahoman, you've got a profile of Stitt. You're going to have a profile of the candidates, and so this first one is on Stitt. I had a chance to read that. I think one of the biggest takeaways I found, and you've already said this a little bit about Stitt, is that he doesn't necessarily have to have all the answers. And what he was saying and those around him were saying is he's a guy that just wants to learn and what's going on. And even my interactions with him, he's always wanting to what do you think about something? It's not our job to give him advice, but but I think that's probably a good strategy to have. A, because if you're going to become governor, you've never done anything like this before, you're going to have to learn on the job. But B, that probably allows some voters to be a little bit more comfortable with you as an outsider if you're saying, hey, I'm willing to learn. I want to surround myself with the smartest people.
No, he's as far away from you can get as being closed-minded about stuff. I've been struck several times by him and his campaign manager, other people in his campaign, about how they're just kind of trying to gorge themselves, just cram on all these programs and government and how it all kind of works. And they're continually surprised by so many things. I remember it was either Stitt or his campaign manager. Remember the other night he was talking about what bail does to poor people, the death spiral of trying to pay your
fines and fees
and trying to get out of county jail. Next thing you know, you're destitute and you can't. You're in jail forever because you couldn't pay your. He was just stunned that work that he's had no exposure to some of this stuff, and he's just kind of continually. Like, really? And I think that the more that he reads about it, the more he thinks that this makes zero sense.
Yeah. Well, I hope he subscribes to the paper. As a good way to catch up on some of these issues. But you're right. There's been moments where he said, I had no idea that this issue was so big. And for a lot of us that are, if you're a policy wonk and in politics and you live here in the capital city, I mean, you're probably like, where have you been, man? But, I think, to be fair, there's a lot of Oklahomans that are just now paying attention to the election. And even just this year have really seen issues like education and healthcare really rise to the forefront. I mean, teachers know it, but people who don't have a kid in school or just your average Oklahomans, it may not have been until this year that they really started to see these issues.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, everybody that kind of lives in their own bubble or their own corridor, and if you don't have to learn what Medicaid expansion is, then you probably aren't going to, or criminal justice specific proposals about that. We do kind of sometimes think, how do you not know about that? But it's quite easy to not know about some of these things.
Yeah, well, it's like when I first started writing about Medicare or Medicaid reimbursement rates. I had no idea how it worked. I had to learn about it, and then I realized, oh, this is how doctors get paid when they see patients who can't afford to go to the doctor. And that's sort of the relevance of whenever the state decides to lower the Medicaid reimbursement rate. A person reads that sentence, it really doesn't mean a lot to them. When you start talking about this is how doctors get paid to see poor people, and seniors and kids. It really becomes relevant.
Yeah, definitely. Well, obviously we're going to continue to talk about this governor's race in the weeks to come, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more about Edmondson here coming forward, especially, you'll have some more coverage of him and a profile of him in the weeks to come. There's other elections, or other races in the ballot, especially in the legislature. You talked about Edmondson had kind of the more vocal crowd at the debate, and I think that's natural. The minority party, it seems to be fired up this year. That includes the legislature. I think it was last Saturday, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat from Massachusetts, she held a rally. It was a public education rally. It was also partly a Democratic rally. A lot of, advocacy for Democratic candidates, of which there are, some decent Democratic candidates in the ballot this year, maybe more than in years past. Dale, talk a little bit about just the legislative race and how it's shaping up. We're not predicting that the Democrats are going to take over, but there are some thoughts that this might be a good year for them, but maybe not in every part of the state.
It could be a pretty good year for them. The important number is going to be that sort of that supermajority line. How close do they remain to that supermajority line, or the number of people that they have to prevent the Republicans from doing anything that raises taxes or anything that needs that supermajority vote. And the more people that the Democrats have, the more that they can take advantage of a fractured Republican Party. Right now in the House, a lot of that fracture has disappeared with people leaving office and getting voted out of office. So we're going to have a new crop of people, freshman legislators, who are going to be a little bit more malleable than someone who's been there for a long time. And so we'll have to keep an eye out on sort of what divisions remain in the Republican Party, especially in the House, and how many Democrats will be there to take advantage of those opportunities.
Yeah. You've got a story in this Sunday's paper about an interesting race. It's already decided, but it's been an interesting race, right?
That's right. In Ponca City, Ken Luttrell was a state representative for 4 years. He lost his seat in 2010, the same year that Governor Mary Fallin got elected, the same year that...
And he was a Democrat, right?
That's right, he was a Democrat. The same year that all statewide offices went to the Republican Party, and it was President Obama's midterm election, which was really a contentious one, if you remember. And so he lost that election, but he has come back. He changed, in the interim, he changed parties. He's now a Republican instead of a Democrat, and he ended up beating the guy who beat him 8 years ago. So I kind of profiled a little bit about him. I talked to the losing candidate, Steve Vaughn, State Representative Steve Vaughn. Talked to him, and that story's going to be in Sunday. I thought it was a pretty interesting deal where someone loses a race but comes back 8 years later in the different party and manages to win back his seat. Well, and still speaks to how important still tribalism is. I mean, we can talk about, issues like healthcare and education can sway voters, maybe independent voters. And I don't want to minimize those issues. I mean, for a lot of voters, they're going to put partisanship aside, and they have issues in their life where I'm going to vote on education, I'm going to vote on healthcare, I'm going to vote on business. But for a lot of people, they're still, they're Republicans and Democrats. And so at the end of the day, that's a big challenge for Edmondson. I mean, even if the polls show that he's in a competitive race, which it seems like he is, at the end of the day, he's got to convince a lot of Republicans.
And independent vote too,
are still important,
and that district that I was talking about is majority Republican. It's, I think, pretty much always been a Republican seat. I talked to Representative Vaughn. He kind of described it as a fluke when the Democrat won the seat and held it for 4 years, but it's now back in Republican hands. And I remember, I think I got an email saying that there's a new Republicans for Edmondson group formed, something like that, which is not unexpected. Every gubernatorial campaign will have, hey, here's people of the other party supporting me. But
I think Hunter put out a Democrats for Hunter thing.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure you can go to Southeast Oklahoma and start your own Democrats for Edmond or for a Stitt group.
Exactly, but you have to. Edmondson really is going to have to get Republican votes.
Yeah.
There are more Republicans in Oklahoma than Democrats now.
Yeah, and I'm interested. There's a lot of areas, as we wrap up here, that you can look at in the state. I'm really fascinated by the Oklahoma City suburbs, the Edmond area, because you have a lot of moderate Republicans.
Right.
But a lot of these voters were really frustrated, this year. And they let it be known this year by voting out some incumbents, or at least when there was an open seat, going with a candidate that, not going with a candidate you would expect them to go in the past. But the question is, Were those Republicans willing to, make a different vote within the arena of a Republican primary? Either one they're voting for is a Republican. November will be, are they willing to cast that ballot for the Democrat? I mean, I'm sure we all have relatives that are just not willing to ever cast that ballot, for the person of the other party. It is real for some people, but in an area like that where you've got a lot of moderate Republicans, you're kind of Chamber of Commerce, pro-business, a lot of them moved where they're at for schools. I can see where Edmondson would appeal to them in a lot of ways, but would they be willing to pull the trigger on a Democrat? That'll be the big question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Those suburban Republicans, I mean, they could be the deciding. They probably will decide whether Edmondson can get elected. Suburban Republicans here and in Tulsa.
Yeah, I mean, you expect Stitt to do well in the rural areas. You expect Edmondson to do well in the urban areas. You're right. The suburbs are probably going to be where this race is decided. Well, we'll keep talking about that in the weeks to come. Lots more political coverage, not just the governor's race, but all other races you can find every day in the Oklahoman and online at newsok.com. With Chris and Dale, I'm Ben with the Oklahoman. Thanks for joining us this week. We'll see you next Friday.